conversation with David Brock, author of the book Blinded by the Right. He talks about the book and his former career as a conservative journalist. This is about an hour.
Hello and welcome to the Newseum in Arlington, Virginia for this week's Close-Up at the Newseum discussion. Hi, I'm John Molesky of the Close-Up Foundation. In just a moment, you'll hear from high school students and adults participating in the Close-Up program this week. But first, I want to introduce you to our topic and guest. Joining us is David Brock. He is the author of Blinded by the Right, The Conscience of an Ex-Conservative. In the book, he chronicles his role in the so-called vast right-wing conspiracy of the Clinton years, and along the way tells many provocative tales about a variety of influential political operatives. His other books include The Real Anita Hill and The Seduction of Hillary Rodham. He has written for Esquire, Rolling Stone, Talk, and done op-eds for the New York Times and the Washington Post. David, welcome to the discussion.
Thanks for having me.
David, the first line in your book in the prologue says, and I'll read it, "This is a terrible book. It is about lies told and reputations ruined." Quite a way to come out of the starting gate. It begs the question, why did you decide to write it?
Well, I think there are a couple reasons. One is that the work that I did as a conservative activist slash writer, both on Anita Hill and the early anti-Clinton stories, is work that over time I came to regret and realized in a lot of ways was mistaken. Since those mistakes were made in a very public way, in ways that got a lot of attention in the press and I think affected people's views of public issues, I thought I owed it to the public to write about my second thoughts about all this and to put that on the record. Second reason is related, but I think that the way that the media treated the Clinton scandals over the years as they were happening was skewed in the sense that it tended to virtually ignore the story that I tell in this book, which is the relentless nature of the opposition to Bill Clinton. And I think that I wanted, when historians look back and try to weigh what really happened here, to have all that on the record too. The short way of phrasing that is to have the right-wing conspiracy revealed, exposed, and documented by somebody who was actually in it. Nobody else could do that because nobody's actually been in it and left, as I have.
You just now, when you described yourself back then as a conservative activist slash writer,
Yeah.
But at the time you thought of yourself as a journalist.
I did. I mean, I thought of myself as I was trying to combine two roles, basically. I was trying to combine the journalistic role, or journalistic hat, with that of a conservative political activist. And ultimately, that didn't really work out so well, as I document in the book, because the bias that was in my head, the conservative point of view, I think was ultimately disabling in terms of trying to ascertain the truth of things. And so everything was tainted, everything was colored, everything was filtered through an ideological prism.
Bernie Goldberg's written a very successful book about media bias, where he charges right-wing, or I mean liberal media bias, not a new charge. You use the phrase in your book a number of times, liberal media, but also your tale describes something quite different than a liberal media.
Right.
What is your analysis of media bias?
Well, I think that you know, this is something that the right has long contended, that there's a liberal media bias, and it's something that I mention in the book because it's part of how I was schooled. My first job out of college was at a magazine published by the Washington Times, and one of the goals, one of the explicit things that was said was we were combating the so-called liberal slant in the media. I think it's changed over time. I think that if that was right 20 years ago, I certainly don't think in the last 10 years you really can say that, because I think that there's so many other media voices now. There's so much alternative media. You've got the Fox News Network. You've got amazing conservative presence in talk radio. So I think you've got now so many voices that you've got a good mix and a good balance. And actually, I would say that in terms of sort of the cable chat world and the experiences I've had promoting this book versus promoting my Anita Hill book 10 years ago, that you know, there's almost a conservative dominance in a lot of ways.
So much more of a market for the Anita Hill book than for this book.
Yeah, well, not so much more of a market, but it was a lot easier to sell because you know, you could do 400 conservative talk radio shows. I said to the publicist for this book, well, we'll just do the liberal shows, and they said, well, actually, you know, you'll be lucky if there's one in every market.
Yeah.
So I certainly don't think the conservatives, in terms terms of the media, are any more underrepresented at all. Yeah.
Another thing that you say in the book is you fought on the wrong side of an ideological and cultural war that divided our country and poisoned our politics. Why were you on the wrong side?
Well, I mean, I ultimately came to the view that it was the wrong side. I started and really cut my teeth in the Bork nomination, which was a major issue in the conservative movement. In a way, I think affected a lot of their strategy and tactics, in the sense that they felt that Bork had been unfairly maligned, and that gave them justification then to do everything they were going to do kind of as payback. Then the Soviet Union fell, and I think that people like Newt Gingrich realized that conservatism only thrives when it has an enemy. And so that enemy became various domestic groups that in some ways were different. And I think that's where, with Bork and then with the Soviet Union falling, you had culture war that ultimately manifested itself most vividly in the 1992 Republican Convention. The reason I was on the wrong side of that is because even when I was defending Bork, even when I was celebrating Newt Gingrich, on social issues, I always was basically a liberal. I came to Washington, and what happened was a process of subordinating my own views and values to those that I could see were a path to being accepted and succeeding in the conservative movement. And so I sold myself out.
And your first reaction to Anita Hill's testimony is that you believed her. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. These are sort of flashes of my own conscience that come out in the book here and there. But again, that ultimately I don't listen to. And there's a scene in the book where I was at the Washington Times at the time, and there are about 10, 12 colleagues in my office watching Anita Hill testify on a Friday morning. And I was the only one in the room after her testimony was completed who said that she seemed credible, and that it seemed unbelievable, almost impossible, that someone would put themselves on national television with such an elaborate story if there wasn't truth in it. That's what I felt Friday morning. By Sunday afternoon, watching the way the conservatives rallied around Clarence Thomas and seeing all the issues that were at stake in the hearing, I was influenced by basically everybody around me, and came out of the hearing feeling that he was wrongly accused. And that's the first article that I wrote that got me a lot of attention in the conservative movement.
One way to interpret that story and then the larger story is that you had an amazing capacity to convince yourself or lie to yourself about what you wanted to believe.
That's right.
And then the ultimate outcome of that is then you could lie to a larger audience.
That's right.
So the credibility question looms large. Why can we believe now that you've got it straight?
Okay. Well, I mean, there are a couple reasons, I think. The most obvious one to me is that this book is filled with names and dates and places. My recollections are quite specific. And the book has been out now for about 2 months. With a few exceptions, the characters in this book have not come forward to dispute anything. And I take the reader in to the room where plans are being hatched, where checks are being written. I name the names.
Very specific.
If these things didn't happen, I think we'd know about it. The conservatives generally are not people who are shy about coming out and saying, you know, well, this isn't true.
Right. You said the Solicitor General, Ted Olson, lied under oath, and he's
right.
not refuted that.
Well, he sort of has. I mean, this issue came up in his testimony before the Senate when he was nominated as Solicitor General, and he sort of bobbed and weaved around this question of what exactly his role was in the Arkansas Project. But I know what it was. I was there just at the time he was, and he was quite involved with the project. He's tried to downplay that during his Senate confirmation, I think, not because anything illegal happened, but I think that because it was, and we'll probably talk about this some more, but this Arkansas Project was nothing more than a well-funded character assassination plan against the Clintons. It was the epitome of the politics of personal destruction, quote unquote, and Ted Ted Olson helped engineer that. He also helped when it was sort of coming apart within the magazine because of allegations that money was being misspent. He engineered the cover-up of that. And so I think those were legitimate issues for him to be asked about in the Senate, and I think he misled the Senate when he testified the way he did.
Was the Arkansas Project, in your mind, the epicenter of the so-called vast right-wing conspiracy?
It's a part of it. I think there are basically two prongs. One is the Arkansas Project, which was funded by Richard Mellon Scaife, who is one of the founding fathers of the modern conservative movement, but is by no means a household name. He decided to spend about $2.2 million just at the American Spectator, just in this project. Meantime, there are tens of millions of dollars washing through every other conservative organization in town to get the Clintons. This was not, to go back to your question about conservatism and journalism, this wasn't journalism. This was a political operation. So that was part of it. I think the other part, which I also played a role sort of unintentionally in, is the Paul Jones sexual harassment suit that was filed against Bill Clinton. And when you look back and construct how you got from Paul Jones to impeachment, the Jones case became the vehicle for the conspiracy. It wasn't terribly vast. There were a few people involved, a lot of financial backing, very single-minded. And there is a section in the book where I describe in 1997, which is 6 months before anybody hears the name Monica Lewinsky, that one of Jones's lead lawyers tells me not only does he not believe his client, but basically explains to me the strategy that becomes the perjury trap, that they've spent 4 years on a fishing expedition backed by tens of thousands of dollars from the conservative movement to dig up every rumor they can about Bill Clinton, and that they are consciously maneuvering to get him into a deposition format where, at a minimum, they can then leak and humiliate the president. I don't think they actually imagined you'd get to impeachment, but that this was a plan. And I think that plan is the conspiracy. And by conspiracy, you know,
yeah, that's exactly. You say vast is overstated,
scheme.
But conspiracy suggests organization. How organized?
It was organized. I mean, all that conspiracy means is a wrongful scheme. And I think if people look at this book, and not only this book, there have been a couple other books written on the subject. Jeff Toobin's book, A Vast Conspiracy, came to it, I think, from what anyone would consider a neutral point of view, and also used the word conspiracy. Basically, what you're talking about is organization and money, and you're talking about what I think anybody would conclude was an abuse of the legal process for partisan political reasons. And I think that's what's wrongful about the scheme.
You mentioned the '92 convention in Houston, and a critical piece about you that maybe you've read by Chris Hitchens,
yeah.
1 or 2 page review.
Right.
And the question he raises is, wait a second. Did it take the Houston convention for you to realize that there was an anti-gay movement within the Republican Party, or a religious right movement within the, because you sort of point to that as a turning point in your thinking about your own life and where you were and what you were doing?
Right. Well, I think what I say about '92 is that becomes a point where I can't deny to myself what's going on. And you talked a little bit before, which I agree with, is one thing we're talking about in terms of being blinded is not so much blinded by the right, but blinded by myself and my own capacity for self-deception. So it's not that in the mid-'80s and late '80s I wasn't aware that there was an anti-gay strain in the Republican Party, and in fact I write about it. I write about Jerry Falwell's backing for Ronald Reagan. It's that in '92, on national television, watching things unfold as they did, that became a point where I consciously knew that I had allied myself with the wrong side. So the rationalization and the denial of that was no longer possible. And yet I still marched ahead.
Yeah, how many years later was it that you finally made the break?
Well, it depends on how you look at it, but at least for another 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was it the publishing of the Hillary Clinton book was that the beginning of the end?
It was. It was in the process of writing that book that I came to question a lot of the fundamentals, and that I came to doubt a lot of what the conservatives were saying about the Clintons from a lot of firsthand experience I had in Arkansas doing a lot of reporting for that book, really trying to make the worst case I could against Hillary Clinton and finding that factually it could not be done. And that really shook my foundations a lot. And so in the process, which took 2 years of churning, is sort of my first step out of the conservative movement.
You know, it sounds almost in a
book.
perverse way you became more of a journalist, that you became more and more concerned about the credibility of your work, therefore you got more involved in fact-checking and not extrapolating from the stories you had and making them more than they were.
Oh yeah, I definitely think that's the case. I think that part of that struggle was within myself to be able to see things in a gray area. And most good journalists are critical and skeptical. And I had a very, I think, black and white mindset, and seeing that the truth of Hillary Clinton, who after all is a human being and is not perfect but also can't be evil, trying to portray that as a real biographer would, which I think I largely succeeded doing, was a big step, I think.
So you continue to be out of step with the times.
Well, that's definitely true.
Because now the journalism has turned to this black and white sort of crossfire type paradigm, and when you're trying to move into a more gray area.
That's definitely true. I was actually thinking about that yesterday, that some of the very early stuff I was doing with Anita Hill and Bill Clinton, 10 years later, that's sort of how a lot of our politics is discussed now on shows like Hardball, where, you know, really people are not only shouting their point of view, but there isn't a lot of room for ambiguity.
Right. Okay. Let's go to our studio audience's questions. Yes, sir, you're first. Hi.
Hi, my name is Keenan Brown, and I'm from Washington, D.C. Mr. Brock, out of all the books that you have written so far, do you have a favorite one, and why?
Well, I think that, you know, in this book, I retract my first book, The Real Anita Hill, so that can't be on the favorite list. The Hillary Clinton book is still important to me personally because of what I just described, because I think had I not undertaken that topic and worked my way through that the way I did, the transition that I made, which has been so good for me, wouldn't have happened. I think that this book is probably the one that will stand the test of time, though, better than either one of them. And so, if I have to pick a favorite, I'll pick this one.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Mr. Brock. My name is Clinton Rayfield, and I live in Washington, D.C. My question to you is, what made you come out with the truth? Was it something spiritually or ethical or what?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's been a long process. The thing that I did that I regret the most was at one point, after I wrote my book on Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, almost 2 years later, I was asked to review a book on the same topic that had some damaging information in it about Thomas and took Hill's side. It's a long story that I tell in the book, but to make a long story short, because I had defended Thomas so vociferously, I had earned a certain level of trust from people around him as a result of publishing my book, and so I had better access to what they really felt and really believed. I found out that some of this damaging information about Thomas in this other book, which was called Strange Justice, was true. Instead of writing the truth then, this is late 1994, I continued to cover that up and attack Anita Hill and attack the writers of that book. And that's when I really hit rock bottom, and I knew that I had written something that wasn't true consciously, which is the first and last time I ever did that, that I was a fraud in the claims that I was making. And so I think that after hitting rock bottom, I did have a crisis of conscience, and I did resolve to not repeat those mistakes again. And so since then, I've been on a path of struggling to do the right thing. And so, yeah, I think it involved ethics much more than it did politics, although ultimately there's a political and ideological transformation involved in what I've gone through as well, which is sort of finding my own values and acting on them.
And the reporters who wrote Strange Justice are a couple of Wall Street Journal reporters.
That's
This was
right.
legitimate sources and
Oh, absolutely.
not a political
It was not, no.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, I know I've asked the credibility question before, and you just asked again how he came to this sort of awakening.
Right.
But let me come at it one more time. What is the most compelling case you could make to people that would say, you know, believe me now, in a way that you couldn't have before? Because by your own admission, you couldn't be believed before.
Right.
And the people you describe here, I mean, quite frankly, it's a world of scoundrels where the truth is barely a consideration.
Right.
It's really what manufactured truth will further an agenda.
Right.
So if you're coming to this from the outside without a strong bias that suggests, I want to believe this person over this person,
Sure.
how does a person who is truly coming in just trying to discern
Right.
the closest thing to the truth sort through it?
Okay, yeah. Well, as I said before, one is the silence is deafening from the people criticized. Okay, let's put that aside. Let's talk about why this book, you've read it, it's not terribly self-serving. I think I am harder on myself than I am on anybody else in the book. A lot of the things I write about in terms of myself are quite unattractive. I can't imagine what any motivation would be to not write the truth about that. So once I made a commitment to coming clean, you know, I just don't see what in terms of, you know, put yourself in my shoes. What's the upside to?
Well, I guess sell a book,
you know,
to sell a book, to create a bestseller. That would be the
even at
upside.
the expense of your own. I mean, because the thing is, here's two paths you could go on.
You were doing it at the expense of your own life. I mean, your personal, strongly held beliefs, whether it be about pro-life or tolerance toward gay people or whatever the political cause might be, you were certainly putting that at jeopardy for yourself and for others.
Yeah, but when I was doing that, I think that what I was doing was taking an easy path. It was easy to do what I did before, to put my head in the sand, to succeed in the way I did. This hasn't been the easy path. I think the easy thing to have done...
No, you take your lumps with this path to success.
I think the easy thing to have done would have been, you know, perhaps I broke with the conservative movement, fine, move on, you know, continue doing what I was doing, which was in 97, 98, writing for a lot of the magazines you mentioned and having a successful freelance journalistic career. But I just felt like I couldn't do that. I couldn't move on without disclosing all these things that had happened. And the reason I made that decision was that this stuff was really weighing on me. And there are a couple scenes in the book where, at what you would consider inappropriate moments, the things from the past that I knew I was just spilling out to people in private settings. And I knew this just had to be written down for people.
In addition to success, obviously another thing you were seeking is acceptance. And what's your take on where you are right now in life? Do you still need that acceptance now just from a different group of people, or have you gotten beyond that?
I think I have gotten very much beyond that, and that's one of the things. I mean, in terms of my emotional attraction to the conservative movement and to being in what was almost kind of like a cult, which has its own system of rewards and incentives and disincentives, I really took to that. And I think that a big part of that was needing to feel embraced and accepted. I've been on my own for a while now. I got fired from the American Spectator in 1997. And I don't work for anybody. Nobody's paying me to write what I'm writing except, you know, a publishing house, not anybody with any political interests. And so, you know, I'm sort of out there on my own and standing on my own 2 feet, and that feels good. And, you know, it's not to say that I'm not aware that there are people on the left who've written positively about this book and have appreciated this book, but when I get those compliments, they just don't feel the way they used to feel from the conservatives. I have some objectivity
you just don't feel
about
you
it.
need them as much now?
Yeah, I feel like I don't need it as much, and I have a certain distance from it, and it's great, but you know, I'm also aware that there are people who, for whatever reason, have their political interests, are going to like you for saying what you're saying now versus then, and I can see that for what it is too. So, you know,
you must have had some allies within the movement that were similarly minded to you, who also maybe were compromising a lot of their strongly held beliefs to move forward. Where are they?
Oh,
I mean, are there other allies that why haven't they abandoned the movement? And come clean? So
Well,
to
I
speak?
think because it doesn't, what we just discussed, it doesn't necessarily do much for you to do that. I mean, I'm going to be 40 years old in July. It's not easy to, not only in the kind of, you know, crossfire journalism that we're talking about, where you brand yourself as conservative. So therefore, you know, you're working on one side, and that's how you market yourself. But in politics generally, you don't see people. I mean, Jim Jeffords did it, but that's an odd case. You don't see people who spend 10, 15, 20 years working for one side make a smooth transition
Build up a lot of political
anywhere
capital
else.
and walk
That's
away
right.
from it
And
in
so
one
I think
day,
it's
yeah.
just not plausible. But I think you're right. And one of the things that I do write in this book is that I don't think I was such an exception, particularly among my own age group. I think that, sure, there were people 20 years older than I am who were more steeped in the ideology of it and probably did have stronger beliefs. But I think a lot of the people who I knew, who were in my age group, and even those who are a little younger, came to it at a time when it was great shtick, and it worked well. And the anti-Clinton thing was amazingly lucrative for a lot of people. And I think people just, you know, they're just not going to walk away from that.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Amber. I'm also from D.C. The way you said that you lied to the public, I was wondering if you intended to mislead people from the beginning, or was it that later on you kind of figured or found out that you had been spreading lies?
Right, yeah, that's a good question. No, when I wrote the first book, I believed that what I was writing was true. When I wrote those early anti-Clinton stories, I also believed them to be true. It was only later, through a combination of things. One is finding out more information later. One is being able to, I think, what we talked about, assess the credibility of sources as I got older, as I did more work, that I could see what the flaws were in a lot of the work. So there really is only the one time that I discussed in terms of that book review of Strange Justice, where there was a conscious act of deception. All the other stuff, I was well-intentioned and sincere in writing it at the time I was writing it. It was only later that I was able to see, get beyond the bias, get beyond the ideology, and look at how those things were constructed to see what the flaws were in them. And that took some time, but ultimately that's a big part of what this book is explaining the process of how that could happen.
Thanks. Hi.
My name is Lynn Pedersen, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. You mentioned having taken your lumps, and I wonder if you have been subject to personal attacks from the right wing since you left the right wing, and what you expect your relationship, how you expect to, what kind of career you expect to develop now that
Who's
you
gonna hire
have
you now?
changed parties.
Good question. Well, on the first question, yes. I mean, this and this process of change that we're talking about, it didn't happen overnight. In 1997, I wrote an article in Esquire where I broke ranks with the conservative movement that was called The Confessions of a Right-Wing Hitman. In 1998, during the impeachment, I apologized to President Clinton for some of the things that had gone on with the Paul Jones case that I was involved in. And at each step of the way, there have been a lot of ad hominem attacks by the conservatives, you know, character assassination, etc. But what hasn't really happened is I think, a reasoned challenge on the substance of what I'm saying about them. I think they're probably in denial about their own history. So that's what I would say about the conservatives. As far as my future career, you know, I expect that I will write another book. I'm working on defining a subject at the moment, and I am still interested in writing, and I'm still interested in politics. I think that what I was advocating before was the wrong thing, but I don't think that I had that I had absolutely no talent, and so I think I'll continue to do along the lines of what I've done here, which is to write about subjects that interest me.
What are you considering?
In
Could you give us
way.
a sense of what you're considering as subject matter?
Well, I think I mean I think I'll stay you know on a political subject, and I'll probably write something that's related to what's going on now with the Bush administration. I don't exactly know how it'll be structured. I'm also interested in something that I touch on in this book, but don't develop all that much, which was the relationship between the mainstream media and the conservative movement, and how it would have been impossible for the conservative movement to achieve what it did without without some success in affecting how the mainstream media viewed particularly the Clintons. And I think that's an interesting thread as well.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Dante Furioso. I'm also a high school student from Washington, D.C. And I was curious if, seeing as how now you say you've gotten beyond the bias that you were experiencing for so long and so heavily before, I was curious if you see yourself at a point where your views could continue to change, and if possibly you might move more towards the left or attach yourself once again to a certain group, even though now you say you are more independent. I was just curious about that.
From right-wing hitman to left-wing hitman? Is that possible?
Well, I think that I mean, one of the things I found out in the experiences that I've had is the ability to change your mind about things it can be a really good thing. And so, as terms of various issues, would I expect that I'd continue to, develop in terms of ideological commitments? I suppose I will. I write at the end of the book that even though I registered as an independent in 2000, that I voted for Al Gore, and that's a vote that I'm still proud of. And I think for the foreseeable future, on a national level anyway, I wouldn't see myself supporting the Republican Party. And I don't expect that'll change. I mean, I think one thing too about ideological conversions, there's a whole history of people who have done this, and most of them have written books about it. And I think when you make a change in the middle of life, after learning a lot, tend to stick with that change, I think. So I think you only do this once, even though I think you refine your views as you go, and I expect to do that. I don't expect to find myself back on the right at any time.
But do you want to continue in an advocacy mode, or would you like to be a straightforward journalist?
Well, no, I think that, what I was saying to the last questioner is that I think that I do have the mindset of an advocate, and so I think that even though I was advocating things that I no longer believe to be true, I think that will always be a component in my writing. I don't expect to go get a job at a newspaper and write things perfectly down the middle. I just don't expect that, yeah.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Anthony Thompson. I'm also a Washington, D.C. high school student. And I was wondering, what made you begin your deceptive career early on? Were you paid or bribed, or was this... Yeah.
Yeah, no, I guess, my first experiences and what led me to become a conservative happened in college. I went to Berkeley, which had a very liberal reputation, and I think that as part of kind of youthful rebellion, I was in some ways reacting against the prevailing liberalism at Berkeley, and so found some satisfaction in identifying myself with the conservative movement. And when I came out of Berkeley, I was exclusively looking for jobs on conservative publications, and so it wasn't. It was a youthful ideological zeal at first. It really didn't have anything to do with making money. That came later. It wasn't really apparent to me at that time that that was even a great career path. It was just I had felt that I wanted to advance the conservative cause, and I had always, even back in high school, been interested in writing, and so I tried to combine the two, and I think that was how things started. The ideal of the career being anything that would get me known or be lucrative, much less any of the deception, that all came later. But there was, as you say, I mean, there were specific cases where, and I write about this in the book, and I think again this is it's pretty unusual, where people within the conservative movement essentially commissioned articles, and the first article that,
in one
that
case,
put me on the
directly
map.
to you, not even through the magazine.
That's right. We haven't talked all that much about the underworld of the anti-Clinton conspiracy, but in one case, a man named Peter Smith, who was a financier of Newt Gingrich's Go Pack, wrote a $5,000 check to have me go down to Arkansas and do some of the early anti-Clinton research that ultimately became part of the Arkansas Project that the American Spectator ran. But you had self-interested political parties, and the same is true of how the Anita Hill story started with a check to the Spectator from someone who was on the board of a pro-Clarence Thomas organization. So, you can't really call that journalism, I think. Yeah.
Not by any definition used here at the museum.
Right.
Yes,
Jay Harbor from Claremont, California. Mr. Brooks, I was very impressed with your comment, your description about the ability of persons, the capacity of persons for self-deception. I was wondering if you'd be willing to comment about how you've observed that capacity in those around you, and also what advice would you give for those who work in the religious and social realms in trying to deal with this personality flaw and social ill?
And if you've observed any of it today, go ahead, take the gloves off.
Well, no, I think obviously I wasn't the only one who was afflicted with this ability to deceive oneself, because you'll see if you read the book that there's an interesting phenomenon, which is that many of the people who made the most outlandish accusations against the Clintons were themselves doing exactly what they were accusing the Clintons of doing. And people ask me, how could this possibly be? I mean, let's take Newt Gingrich, who was having an extramarital affair during this period, where he said, I'm going to say the word Monica in every speech until, Bill Clinton resigns or is impeached. What's the thought process of somebody who is so vulnerable themselves on these same ishes?
Did you know at the time about Mr. Gingrich's alleged indiscretions?
Fact, the earliest that I can remember is that after the Republicans took control of Congress in 1994, I was hearing in social settings in early '95 concern of people around Gingrich that he would be subjected to a different kind of scrutiny now that he was Speaker, and that he was vulnerable on things like this. And of course, it's not just Gingrich. I mean, I think that there was endemic hypocrisy in the conservative movement. And part of that is part of that self-deception. I guess it is. I guess it's a view that the ends justifies the means, and that what they're doing is okay because their goals are the right goals, and even though they're doing the same thing Clinton's doing, Clinton's goals are the wrong goals. So he can be taken down and destroyed for those things. I suppose that's part of it.
Well, that's interesting. In following up on your question, that's an interesting concept in that there's an ethical standard. That is, you can lie, or you can do something unethical for a greater good.
That's
In
right.
other words, you can lie to terrorists to save lives of hostages. That would be
Right.
one example. Are you suggesting that these people weren't lying, that's the way they were lying? That they thought that ultimately their cause was righteous, and so their lie was acceptable in this larger war?
I think so, because I think that the ideology was almost like a religion for many people, and I think that permitted people to take a lot of liberties with the truth on things that they saw as not as important as the goal of attaining political power for their own partisan ends. Yeah.
Sir, was part of your question sort of how does somebody guard against self-deception? You could just nod. I know you don't have a microphone over there now, but was that part of your question? Yeah. Do you care to address that part? I mean, you've been your life story that you tell would certainly make you expert in that regard.
Right. Yeah, sure.
What advice, as you've asked for, could you give, and how do you check yourself when you're trying to look at your own political views?
Well, I think a lot of it just comes from a certain kind of self-awareness that I didn't have. I was not a terribly reflective person. As you'll see, particularly in the early years, I never really second-guessed anything I did. I just charged ahead with a mission, and the mission was, defeating the left. And so I leapt out of bed in the morning and went to it. And so this period that I've been through in the last 4 or 5 years has been a period of, perhaps too much self-reflection, it feels like at this point, but I think it was necessary. And I think, obviously thinking about the moral consequences of your actions is really the key. And for whatever reason, I think there are a lot of people who may be attracted to politics who don't have that capacity, and I'm certainly not the only one who was blinded.
So it's not necessarily assuming you're wrong. The other extreme, it's assuming that maybe you're not right.
I think that's a great way of putting it, yeah.
Hi.
Hi, yeah, I'm curious because you've been involved on all sides of the political spectrum. I'm curious on your take, being that choices are directly related to freedom, and it seems the more choices we have, the more freedom we have. I'm curious as to whether you believe the two-party system which exists here in the country actually limits the potentials of our democracy.
It's a good question. I think that well, one thing that has been limiting about it, I think, is that it's permitted there to be excesses on both sides. And one thing I've been criticized in this book for is focusing just on excesses of the conservatives. I think that the excesses of the conservatives have been, in the period that I write about, unprecedented. But I do think that what's happened in general is that there's been much less discussion of the substance of politics and the issues of politics, and too much on personality and personal attack. And I think it's possible that because you haven't had a healthier debate, and you haven't had people stand up, even within the parties, to take different points of view, and that both are so much down one line or another, that things have developed in a way that there doesn't seem to people to be a lot of choice between the two.
Is it safe to assume that that's where you're coming from with that question, that you don't think there's much choice between the two major parties?
Yeah, I feel like as perhaps citizens of a country, we may benefit from having more choices.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to argue with that, but I will say...
What are the issues, though, at stake? In other words, this isn't all just about destruction for destruction's sake of individuals.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I think that it's wrong to say that I think that unfortunately, partly because of what's happened to the debate, and partly because of the way that the debate takes place, so much of it in crossfire formats, that what has gotten lost is that there are fundamental distinctions between the two parties.
Well, let's take the case of the Clinton. Yeah, let's take the case of Bill Clinton and those 8 years. Bill Clinton led the charge on welfare reform. He out-Republicaned the Republicans in certain issues.
That's
and
right.
So part of, if you're looking at this from a purely public policy standpoint, you might say, hey, you're getting some of the things you want. What's your problem with this guy?
Right.
So what are the issues that weren't being furthered under the Clinton years? Or the opposite of that, what was he promoting that people were so outraged about?
Well, that's a great question. It's a little complicated. I think that you would think that because Clinton successfully moderated, triangulated, co-opted certain Republican issues, that would mean there would be less Republican opposition, but actually it worked the opposite way. better Clinton did, the more successful Clinton was, the more it became apparent that he was going to survive and had awesome political skills, the more desperate the Republicans became. And so I think that by robbing them of certain issues and leaving them basically with social issues that were not terribly popular in the country and still are not, they left them with a very limited agenda. And so I think that's why they began to focus on a lot of the scandal as a means of getting the Clintons, and that there was this frantic search for a silver bullet on something that would be proven unethical. And so the issues really weren't that debated all that much.
Yeah,
and I
it
think
sounds
that
like
on
you're
many
describing
things,
as power for power's sake.
right?
That it's who gets credit, not what gets done.
Absolutely right. And I think that that you're right. That the in ideological terms, what were the conservative objections to the Clintons? I think a lot of it had to do with what the Clintons symbolized, not so much what the Clintons did or didn't do. And if you look back at 1992, you see that in the minds of the right, the Clintons are the first of their generation to come into power. In the mind of the right, that generation comes out of the 1960s. Hillary Clinton has her own career. And then those early issues, Jennifer Flowers, smoking pot, those are sort of cultural issues that the right is trying to raise against Bill Clinton. And so I think the culture war that we talked about earlier, I think the Clintons get ground up in the gears of that culture war, and that they symbolize certain things, even though I think in a lot of ways wrongly. They certainly weren't cultural radicals. But that was the way the conservatives saw it, and they saw that as I think, a unique threat in the sense that they resisted all these social changes since the 1960s, and here they were represented in this
Does
first
this
family.
change now in the sense that we've had the 9/11 attacks, and now they're suddenly this sleeping giant that had the luxury of debating presidents' public or private lives, now suddenly has a foe and an imminent threat? Does that change the politics here? Because part of what you're describing sounds to me like a politics of complacency. We had the luxury of being self-indulgent and getting into moralizing back and forth of who's more righteous than whom, but now we have something else going on. Do you think this changes? You know these people. Will this change the players?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it changes, the tenor has changed for the moment, for a couple of reasons. One is the conservative attack machine is not really geared up for battle right now because they're in power. There's no reason to be. And so I think that once you move toward the next presidential election cycle, and once there is if there is a strong and credible threat to Bush, you'll see some of the same tactics. I mean, I think it's a mistake, and people make a mistake, to view what happened in the 90s as being primarily about Clinton. I think that Clinton was targeted because he was there and he was in their way, and that's as simple as that. And that
You're saying that any Democrat in the White House would have been subject to similar strategies?
Yes, and as soon as somebody else gets in their way, whether it's Tom Daschle or somebody else, and we've already seen in the case of Daschle, we've seen Daschle compared to Saddam Hussein in Republican issue attack ads that have been run. So the tactics and the techniques are the same. I think that you're seeing them only in use right now at the margins because the war on terrorism
is there
taken
similar
up so
vitriolic rhetoric on the left?
No, I think there is a distinction, and I think that, as I said, you can point to certain excesses on both sides, but there is nothing like the hate that emanates from the conservative movement on the other side that animates so much of their politics. I think there is nothing like the organization on the liberal side in terms of discipline. You see a very diffuse, you really can't even use the word liberal movement. You see a very diffuse coalition of interests. On the right, you see very much a top-down organization. And you see that they are very disciplined and they are always on message. So I think they fight in very different ways. And frankly, I mean, I think the history of the use of the political smear, I think if you look back, even, even back before this the time period I'm talking about in this book, I think it comes out of the Republican Party. I do. Going back to McCarthyism. And this is really, I mean, in some ways you can look at the 90s as a second wave of McCarthyism.
Yes, ma'am. Hi.
Hi, I'm Phyllis Eggert, San Francisco. Sounds like you have matured and come to terms with who you are and what you really believe in.
Why, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. You're talking to Dave.
Not you. And, that must feel really good.
It does.
I'm happy for you, but all the people that you've maligned, what have you heard from them, and who is suing you?
Right. Okay, let's see. Well, I haven't heard, I have written to Anita Hill twice apologizing personally. This book is a public apology in a pretty major way. But back in, even before I was thinking of writing a book about this in early 1998, I wrote a personal note to Anita Hill. And then last summer when I finished the book, I also, the book was excerpted in Talk magazine, and I sent her that excerpt and wrote a personal note to her. As I mentioned earlier...
Did she respond?
She has not, no.
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier, I did, during the height of the impeachment, try to make amends for some of what I had done in terms of Clinton, and I was so much against the impeachment, I felt I needed to say something about that, and did write an open letter to Clinton, and he did publicly accept that apology at that time. So, I can understand that there'll still be some hard feelings, and I would have them too, because certain kind of damage can't be undone, because what I'm writing now is really not in the heat of the moment anymore, and some of this damage was done in the heat of the moment. But I do think there's an appreciation, particularly among liberals, for the idea of redemption, and so I hope that it will go down pretty well.
The second part of the question: any litigation? Are you planning something, ma'am? You're not. Okay.
No, no, actually, no. There never has been, and there isn't in this book, certainly.
Yes, ma'am. Hi.
Hi, my name is Amanda Proctor. I'm from Washington, D.C. And in dealing with politics and reporters, most stories are filled with lies and exaggerations. Do you feel that it makes you a better writer to be able to tell the truth, even though society and the people crave entertainment over everything else?
But are you assuming that most of the things you read are filled with lies or half-truths?
That's what I've been told.
Yeah. How do you know that wasn't a lie when you were told that? I'm sorry.
Well, I think it's a good practice to read everything with
questions.
Take everything with a grain of salt, and I think that particularly the idea that so much of politics is now discussed in a format that does strike a lot of people as entertainment, and with it, entertainment comes overstatement and sometimes embellishment and overly dramatic kinds of presentations. So no, I mean, I certainly wouldn't say that. I mean, I think that I have become a more balanced and reliable person, but I wouldn't hold myself up as better than anybody else in terms of my journalism, certainly. There's a lot of great journalism that's still practiced today, and so, I wouldn't say that at all.
Ma'am, we have time for a very quick final question and a very quick final
Doris
answer.
Toohill from Orleans, Massachusetts, Cape Cod. I'm listening to you and thinking this is like a religious conversion that you had. Can I ask personally, was there something that triggered it? I mean, one event maybe? Because what I'm hearing is you did a lot of note-taking and fact-finding on the Arkansas project. Do you deny the things that you found there, that you investigated?
Okay, and I'm sorry to do this to you.
Okay.
A thoughtful question that we have about 20 seconds for you to respond to.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that, as I was saying earlier, the credibility of the people who told me things when I was working on that Arkansas project, I think, is pretty low. And so I think that most of what came out of that, and these things were spread all over the country. It wasn't just, the Arkansas Project, the American Spectator, the Vince Foster rumors and drug dealing, all these things about the Clintons that were just smears, all those things I think were wrong. The conversion moment, I think, if I have to point to one thing, it was this issue of consciously telling an untruth in print, knowing this damaging information about Clarence Thomas, covering it up, seeing what I was capable of, seeing where the ideology had led me, and really hitting rock bottom was the one moment. Although there are a series of other moments, and there's not one aha moment, I think, when I all of a sudden see the light. You know, it does. It is both a political and a moral conversion, I think.
The book is Blinded by the Right. The author is David Brock. It's a good read. You can judge for yourself. David, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions and comments. Next week, we'll be back here in the museum, and our discussion will be how press coverage has evolved from the events of 9/11 to today's questions about intelligence failures. Our guest will be Cox Newspaper's White House correspondent Bob Deans, along with syndicated radio talk show host Laura Ingraham. Until then, for all of us at the Freedom Forum Museum and Close-Up Foundation, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.